The hippies didn't much like the Beatniks, and they really hated the punks. Punks didn't much like the hippies, and they really hated the hardcore kids. So it's just been this cycle, I think, of bohemians hating each other.
Hi, I'm Anthony Fisher for Reason TV, and I'm with Ada Calhoun, the author of St. Mark's is Dead, The Many Lives of America's Hippest Street, which is a loving study of the 3 blocks or so in the East Village of Manhattan from pre-colonial times to the present day. Ada has written for the New York Times Magazine, was a crime reporter for the New York Post, and actually grew up on St. Mark's Place during an era when it wasn't exactly kid-friendly. Ada, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
I feel like the book makes St. Mark's out to be a microcosm of eccentric America, and everyone from the first post-Civil War black musical performers to 20th century anarchists, communists, the Beats, hippies, punks, skaters, they all had their time on St. Mark's. What is it about those 3 or 4 blocks? Is it something in the water?
People have told me it's like there's a ley line or one of those psychic mystical streams underneath it. In the early 1900s, it was a big spot for union headquarters. There were all these different unions, like the shipbuilders and the pipe fitters. They were all along St. Mark's Place. And so then it was just this gathering spot for revolutionaries. So since then, I think then it had this reputation, and everybody who came there for the reputation and then felt like it was an obligation to keep that reputation going.
Is there anything that's kind of stayed the same? Are there any institutions or personality traits about the neighborhood that have stayed the same, at least for the last 100 years?
Well, I think even going back further, it's always been a place for runaways. So starting with Peter Stuyvesant, who was the Dutch Director General back in the 1600s, and he really hated that there were so many prostitutes and pirates at the tip of the island in what was then, the middle of town. So he started this Bowery farm up in what was then way up in the country, and what of course is now downtown Manhattan. You
wrote that some of the first quote-unquote Bohemians of the 1960s were actually posers who were aping a French caricature of gypsy culture. Were they able to create any authentic culture of their own, or was it all just a pose?
Well, I think the line between posers and authentic bohemians is, it's pretty thin. I think depending on which side of it you're on, like anybody else is a poser. And one thing that I noticed looking at the history of the counterculture is almost every group that came in thought the group that went after them and the group that went before them were posers and were awful. So the hippies didn't much like the Beatniks, and they really hated the punks. Punks didn't much like the hippies, and they really hated the hardcore kids. So it's just been this cycle, I think, of bohemians hating each other for a long time.
I guess the constant turnover and the creative destruction of the culture of St. Mark's is kind of what keeps it vibrant. Would you agree with that?
I think that that's true. I think that it really has stayed vibrant because there's been so much turnover. And also when people get there, they just fall in love with it, and they feel like they own it, and they feel like it's really a place that lets them become who they were meant to be. It's a real forge for identities of young people. That's still true, I think.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the mid to late 60s when Andy Warhol started throwing his parties there, and how did that go over with the natives?
The natives didn't like it. They, I think we look back now and we can see who was important to the culture and who was wonderful. And I think back then it was a lot harder for people to tell in the moment. And so I had people tell me that, they would see Andy Warhol walk down the street and they'd be like, oh, he's ruining the neighborhood. They're so mad because, they missed it when it was quieter, and they missed it when it was these little shops. So during the 60s, it was a real hangout for artsy people and creative people. And then in 1967, there was a big, violent, horrible murder of this hippie named Groovy and his girlfriend. And they were, she was raped, and they were both killed in a basement on Avenue B, so not very far from St. Mark's Place. And once that happened, all the suburban kids were basically forbidden from coming to hang out on St. Mark's Place anymore. It wasn't seen as this innocent, fun, free love and drugs kind of magical place anymore. And so it became just a breeding ground for crime and drugs. And it fell really quickly into disrepair. So the CBGB era came out of that because you had all these young people who kind of liked the scuzziness. So they showed up, and there were all these free or very cheap spaces for them. So, that it was a real place for them to live cheaply and to do what they wanted to do, which was to play this kind of new kind of music.
Young people would move from the suburbs to St. Mark's, and they'd be seduced by the romance of poverty. And you specifically talked about the legendary artist Keith Haring, who had lived in the city for 2 years before he started putting up street art telling the clones to go home. As a born and bred St. Markser, what do you make of people who aren't even from there deciding what's authentic?
I always think it's really funny when anybody of any era, and it's been going on for a long time, get to a place and decide they know who belongs there, and that they're going to defend it from all of these invaders who are coming in. And even now I see it, and I'll see people be like, oh, these stupid NYU, New York University kids who are just like, they're making so much money and they are throwing these loud parties, and and I say, like, well, when did you get here, and what do you really think people's reaction to you was? Because I can guarantee it probably wasn't positive. I had one woman who said to me, she was like, these kids, they just come in here and they're drinking and drugging and being so loud and horrible, and we did that in the 70s, sure, but when we did it, it was cool. Like, yeah.
No irony either.
No, it's like, it's sweet how everybody believes that.
Yeah.
And it's every generation has, like, our grandparents believe that, and we believe that, and our grandchildren will believe that too.
So can you talk a little bit about growing up on St. Mark's Place in the 80s?
Yeah, I was born in 1976. Okay. So it was like the absolute worst time in the street's history, basically ever. And it was dangerous and dirty, and there were always homeless people sleeping in the lobby, and there were people nodding out on the corners, and
but you're smiling, so...
I was fine. Like, I didn't know any better. Yeah. I was a kid, I thought it was totally normal. It wasn't until I was a little older that I went to the suburbs for the first time. I wrote a story for the New York Times Magazine about it, actually, where I went to Kent, Ohio to visit my cousins, and I came back and I was like, are you kidding me? Like, do you know what they have? Like lawns and carpet and just like all these things that I'd never really seen before.
If you could describe St. Mark's in one simple sentence, what would it be?
St. Mark's is like the main street for the counterculture, and it's always been someplace people ran to find other people like them.
And do you think that's still the case now?
I think it's totally still the case. Mm-hmm. You go out at 2 a.m. and it's still full of young people, and they're still having this very magical experience.
Thanks so much for talking to us, Ada Calhoun, the author of St. Mark's is Dead, The Many Lives of America's Hippest Street. It's a great book about the cyclical nature of constant change of a wonderful and ever countercultural street in New York City. Thanks so much for talking to us, Ada.
Thanks for having me.
For Reason TV, I'm Anthony Fisher.